It was late afternoon when I saw the flashing lights behind me. At first, I thought it was another routine traffic stop, maybe someone speeding or running a light. But the longer the cop followed me, the more my gut tightened. I'd been driving on the interstate, heading home after a long day of meetings, when the sirens blared. I pulled over to the shoulder, glanced at my rearview mirror, and saw the officer approach. He was tall, with a rigid posture and a no-nonsense expression, his uniform perfectly pressed. He didn't seem to acknowledge the rank of the vehicle I was in, a blacked-out SUV with military plates. Instead, he stopped just shy of my window, his hand on his belt. "Good evening, sir. License and registration, please," he said curtly, his voice flat. I handed over my documents without saying a word, but I could feel the tension rising. I wasn't sure why, but something about this officer felt different. I could tell by the way he studied the documents and glanced at my uniform that he wasn't just dealing with a civilian. "Are you aware of the speed limit, sir?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm well aware," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "But there's nothing to worry about." His gaze flickered back to my plates, and then, without another word, he stepped back and reached for his radio. Something in his movement seemed off. I could feel the cold chill of uncertainty creeping into my chest. I watched him for a moment, waiting for him to return to my window. But instead, he turned away, talking into his radio. The faint static crackled through the air as he muttered something I couldn't quite hear. Minutes passed, and I shifted in my seat, trying to stay calm. My mind was running through every possible scenario. There was no reason for this to be anything other than a routine stop. I was just a general heading home after a long day, but something about this officer made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just questioning my speed. When he finally turned around, his expression had changed. He was no longer the indifferent officer I had first encountered. His eyes were now steely, like he was sizing me up. He approached the window again, but this time, there was an edge to his movements. He didn't ask for any more paperwork. Instead, he just stared at me for a moment, his jaw set in a hard line. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle, sir?" he said, his tone firm, almost challenging. I blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he repeated, more insistently. "Step out of the vehicle." A flicker of disbelief crossed my mind, but I knew I had to stay composed. "Is there a reason you're asking me to get out of my vehicle?" He didn't answer right away, but his hand hovered near his holster as he watched me. It wasn't the usual posture of an officer conducting a traffic stop. It was something else entirely. I felt my heart rate pick up. This wasn't normal. It wasn't right. I was a decorated officer in the U.S. Army, someone who had served this country with honor. This officer had no idea who I was, but I could tell by his stance that he wasn't just performing his duties, he was pushing something deeper. "Look," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've told you I'm a general in the U.S. Army. I don't think I need to explain myself further, but I will if you insist." The officer didn't flinch. Instead, he gave me a sharp nod, signaling me to step out once again. His tone became colder, sharper. "I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. Step out of the car now." For a split second, I considered my options. I could resist. I could refuse and ask for a superior officer to step in. But I wasn't about to escalate this situation unnecessarily. I had seen what can happen when misunderstandings spiral out of control, and I wasn't about to let that happen to me. I slowly opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me. The officer didn't seem impressed. He kept his distance, watching my every movement, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "You're being detained for questioning," he said bluntly. His eyes didn't meet mine, they kept scanning me, like I was a threat he needed to monitor. At this point, I could feel the adrenaline flooding my system. But I wasn't going to lose my cool. I needed to find out what exactly was going on and why I was being treated this way. The officer took a step back, and for the first time, he looked directly at me, his eyes now sharp, like he was appraising every detail. The awkward tension in the air was thick, but I didn't let it faze me. I had been in high-pressure situations before, but something about this one felt different, more personal. Detained for questioning? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. What's the problem, officer? I've done nothing wrong. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze lingering on my uniform. He then took a long look at my hands. I followed his gaze instinctively, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't as if I had anything to hide. But the look in his eyes suggested he was searching for something, some reason to escalate this. Just then, the silence was broken by the sound of another vehicle pulling up behind us. A second patrol car, lights flashing but no sirens. A second officer got out, a woman this time, her eyes scanning the scene with practiced professionalism. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her voice calm but observant. The first officer, the one who had stopped me, didn't answer right away. His shoulders were stiff, his eyes flickering between me and the new arrival. "I've got him under control. Just some routine questioning." "Routine questioning?" the second officer asked, her tone a little skeptical as she looked at me. "For what exactly?" The first officer looked back at her, then turned back to me, his expression hardening. "He's not cooperating." I shook my head, frustration bubbling under my calm exterior. "I've been nothing but cooperative, officer." There was a pause, and in that moment, I could tell something was about to change. The second officer stepped closer, her eyes narrowing, clearly not buying what the first officer was selling. The standoff between the two of them was palpable, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that this might be a misunderstanding. But just as quickly, I realized the situation was far from over. The second officer moved closer, her presence a stark contrast to the rigid tension of the first. She looked me over, her gaze sharp but not unfriendly. For a brief moment, I felt like there was a chance I could talk my way out of this, if she was willing to listen. "Sir, I think we can clear this up," she said, her voice calm, but with an underlying firmness. "Let's take a step back and talk this through. There's no need for further escalation." The first officer stiffened, his jaw clenching as he exchanged a quick glance with her. "I've already got him under control," he repeated, but this time his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. The woman officer glanced at him, then back at me. Her eyes softened for a second, as though weighing something. "Maybe so," she said slowly. "But I think we need to make sure we're all on the same page here. It's not every day we pull over someone with military plates." That struck a chord. The insinuation was clear now. It wasn't about a traffic violation. It wasn't about a routine stop at all. It was about me, specifically, my rank, my uniform, and my presence on this road. "Is there a specific reason you stopped me, officer?" I asked again, my voice a little firmer now. I was done being the passive party in this exchange. The first officer hesitated, his eyes darting around, as if looking for something to justify his actions. But he didn't say anything. His silence was telling. "I've been nothing but respectful, and I'd appreciate it if you treat me with the same," I said, keeping my voice controlled but firm. The woman officer nodded slowly, her face now showing a flicker of understanding. She turned her attention back to her colleague, a hint of authority in her tone. "I think it's time we reassess this situation." I held my breath, watching the first officer. The tension was still thick, but something in the air had shifted. For the first time, the power dynamic felt like it was moving in my favor. The first officer finally broke eye contact, his gaze flicking away for a split second as if he were trying to regain control of the situation. The woman officer's steady presence seemed to have rattled him more than I expected. She took a step closer to him, speaking in a low voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the body language said it all. She was giving him an option, a chance to back down. The more I watched, the more I realized that her authority here was undeniable, even if it wasn't being openly asserted. The officer seemed to swallow his pride, slowly turning back to me with a more neutral expression. I wasn't aware of your rank, sir. My mistake. He cleared his throat, taking a step back. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. His sudden shift was all I needed to hear. His posture had relaxed, and that told me everything. The woman officer turned to me now, her expression still calm, but with a small nod of acknowledgement. I apologize for the confusion, sir. We'll take it from here. You're free to go. I gave her a brief nod of my own, still processing what had just happened. As much as I wanted to feel a sense of justice in this moment, there was still a lingering question: why did this officer think it was necessary to stop me in the first place? I felt the weight of the unasked question hanging in the air, but I wasn't about to dig any deeper. Not now. Not after everything that had just happened. Thank you, I said, my voice measured but relieved. I turned and began walking back to my vehicle. As I slid into the driver's seat, I could see the first officer still standing by his patrol car, his hands clasped behind his back. I had no intention of prolonging this moment further. I started the engine, shifted into gear, and drove off, watching in my rearview mirror as the two officers disappeared from view. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than I would ever know. The miles seemed to stretch on forever as I drove, but my mind was racing. The encounter lingered in my thoughts, gnawing at me. It wasn't just the way I'd been treated, it was the underlying tension that had colored the whole situation. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became: this wasn't a random traffic stop. It wasn't a simple case of a mistaken identity or miscommunication. There was something beneath the surface, something more personal. As I drove down the familiar stretch of highway, I found myself replaying every moment, every word. I knew the officer hadn't acted alone. There had been a clear difference in the way he treated me compared to the second officer. While she had extended professional courtesy, the first officer had been aggressive from the start, as if he was looking for something to go wrong. What had set him off? The question gnawed at me. My military rank? The uniform? Or was there something more, something that went deeper than I was willing to admit? I didn't have an answer. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that, for some reason, I had been targeted. I knew I had to follow up, figure out what had triggered this situation. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about the principal. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. When I finally reached my destination, I didn't feel the usual sense of relief. The car stopped in front of my house, and I sat for a few seconds, staring at the front door, lost in thought. I had no intention of letting this go. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice, at least not in the way most people think of it. It was about ensuring that something like this didn't happen again. Not to me, and not to anyone else. This wasn't over. The following day, I couldn't let go of the unsettling feeling. I went through the usual motions, meetings, briefings, reports, but my mind kept drifting back to the incident. It wasn't just a one-off experience, it had left a mark. Something needed to be done. I decided to call in a favor. I knew people higher up the chain who could dig into this, but I needed to approach it with care. I wasn't interested in making a scene or starting a confrontation. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had a responsibility, not just as a military officer, but as someone who had seen enough of the system to know when something was wrong. I got in touch with a colleague who worked in internal affairs, someone I trusted. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, an old diner on the outskirts of town, far enough from any prying eyes. When we sat down, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything, every detail, every exchange. I didn't embellish. I didn't overstate. Just the facts. My contact listened intently, nodding as he took notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. You did the right thing coming to me. This isn't something we can ignore. I gave a short nod, appreciating his response but not feeling any better. I need to know why this happened. I need answers. He looked me in the eyes, his gaze unwavering. I'll make sure we look into it. But be prepared. People don't like to be questioned, especially when they're in a position of power. I wasn't looking for a guarantee, but his words echoed in my mind as I left the diner. The feeling of injustice was still there, but now, I felt a sense of purpose. I wasn't just going to let it slide. I wasn't going to be part of the problem. The investigation took time, and it wasn't a smooth ride. There were dead ends, quiet threats, and more than one door slammed in my face. But, in the end, the truth came to light. The officer involved had a history of overstepping his authority, making unwarranted stops based on personal biases and gut feelings. His actions weren't just a case of poor judgment, they were systematic, rooted in something much deeper. The department took action, and the officer was placed on leave while an internal review took place. It wasn't the swift, definitive closure I had hoped for, but it was something. The system had responded, and that was all I could ask for. As I drove home that evening, the weight of the situation finally began to lift. Justice wasn't always immediate, and it wasn't always easy. But sometimes, it was enough to know that things were being set right. It wasn't just about the encounter anymore. It was about making sure that no one else would have to go through what I did. It was about taking the first step toward change. And that, in itself, was a victory.